I think our next two speakers constitute together one of the most fascinating conjunctions of historians that we've had here, certainly since the explosion that took place in the 2002 symposium when Jim Haley and Steve Harden talked about Sam Houston. Today, we may not have an explosion, but we've got two historians who have spent a great deal of time in the archives and pulling together detailed histories of Texas, and most specifically of the warfare in Texas that took place with the Native American groups who were here, both indigenous and, as they were called, immigrant groups, such as the Cherokee. There are questions that can be asked of these two historians on so many levels, and their histories taken in tandem represent some of the biggest questions as well as the most minuscule questions that historians have to answer. Not just what was that last name on the muster roll and what exactly was the name of the creek and the place on the creek and the place where it is now that the action took place, but to go to the other end of the spectrum, why do we do this? Why are we so interested? What are the most important questions? Are the most important questions simply, to quote Dr. McGee, as he quoted von Ranke, just to see what the actual physical events were on a particular day? Or do we need to get inside people's heads? If we get inside people's heads as historians, then we're automatically into that area of postmodernism. We're already into that area of no definite answers with only one history. The reason these people were trying to kill each other in the Texas Revolution and the Texas Republic is because they had different ideas about right and wrong, and you could even say different ideas of reality. What was going on during the Texas Revolution? I tell my students that if you could have four guys in 1835-36 lined up all shooting their muskets in the same direction, and each one of them might have a different idea of why, not only why he was fighting, but what kind of war he was fighting. Was he there fighting a Mexican Civil War? Was he there trying to grab land for himself in the United States? Was he there as an outraged colonist who thought he had been wronged? Or was he there because he liked to kill people? Think about it. There are people in war, in every war, that just like to kill people. If you don't believe me, read Noah Smithwick, who says that on the way from Gonzales to Bear, there were all kinds of people, and some of them didn't give a damn what they were fighting for. They just liked a good fight. And if you think about it, you know, in that Battle of Gonzales, it was the Texans who initiated the violence, not the Mexican army. It was the Texans who crossed the Guadalupe over to the other side of the river and attacked the Mexicans early in the morning. They weren't just saying, you know, come take our cannon. They said, well, if you don't come take our cannon, we're going to come kill you anyway. It's a fact. And so, as we repeat these histories, I won't repeat what I said this morning about these different and multiple perspectives, but another thing to keep in mind, I'm glad Dr. McGee mentioned one of my favorite historians and anthropologists, the late Michel Rolph-Trouillot, who wrote the book Silencing the Past, Power in the Production of History. One of the things that Trouillot brings to mind again and again and again, and something I've certainly written about in my own work, is how do our visions of the past, let's say the past that's taking place in 1835-36, become distorted by the lenses through which we see that past. the lenses in the form of the histories written by Brown and Wilbarger, the lenses in the paintings done by McCardle and Onderdonk, the lenses of one era's history, let's say the 1890s, early 20th century, and how they turn their back on the traditional history and start doing revisionist history, which then, after a couple of generations, that is us, when we come up, that revisionist history, demonizing, let's say, the Mexican army around the years 1900, 1903, 1906, when a lot of those novels and movies and paintings and histories are being done. When it gets to our generation, the revisionist history of 1900 has become the traditional history that we were taught, even though it was written tendentiously and with a heavy agenda, especially a racial agenda, in 1900 when that material was being created. So how do we get out of this hall of mirrors? How do we get out of this postmodern dilemma in which everyone has a different idea about what was real? Well, what we do, to go back to Collingwood, another one of the great historians and philosophers who've ever written history, who was mentioned also by Dr. McGee, we take the evidence, not what somebody said in 1900 who just may have made it up, but we take the evidence of the contemporaries, the evidence that these men have found in the archives, the National Archives, the Bayer Archives, the archives of the Texas government, the archives of the Army. We take a look at all of this material, these thousands and thousands of fragments, and we begin to put them to the test. We begin to ask questions. And the great Collingwood has a segment of his book called The Idea of History, which is based on a little story about a Scotland Yard inspector. And the question is, who killed John Doe? And if the great inspector went around just asking one person after another in Oxford, who killed John Doe, in one of these great little British murder mysteries that he incorporates into his meditation on what history is. If you just keep saying, who killed John Doe, you get a lot of answers. One lady rushes in and said, I killed John Doe. He tried to molest me. But then she had said that for the last 6 men to be killed in Oxford. And so the daughter of a man living next door rushes in and says, I killed John Doe. And it turns out she's afraid her father did it, and she wants to throw the man off the trail. And so the kinds of questions that the inspector from Scotland Yard begins to ask is, why were there glove buttons in the furnace with the ashes of gloves? Why did the man next door give away his coat to the rag and bone man? And why was there green paint smudged on the sleeve? The same green paint newly painted on the garden gate of the man who ended up with a knife in his back the night before. Every question generates an answer, and every answer generates more questions, and we begin to put our theories and our interpretations to the test. I may have told some of you this before. If so, I apologize, but it bears repeating. When I teach historiography and historical methods at North Carolina State, and I have all those master's degree students come in, the first question I ask them is, how many of you are interested in studying the past? And of course, everyone puts up their hands. This is the first day of graduate school. They'd better be. But you know what I tell them? When they all say they're interested in studying the past, I say, well, too damn bad, because it's gone. And you can't see it. And you can't compare your version of it to what really happened, and you can't compare my version of it to what really happened. You can compare your version of it to my version of it. And we'll see which one best matches. the fragmentary and complicated and self-contradictory evidence that has come down to us in the present from the past, because that's all we have. So here we have two men who have gone to the archives, each with a good heart, and each with analytical skills, and each with the intention of writing history, I think, I haven't asked them this question, like Ranke said it should be written to a certain extent, wie it eigentlich gewesen, like it really was. And yet they come out with rather different attitudes and rather different stories and rather different images and perhaps even different morals about the Texas past. And so what we provide in the San Jacinto Symposium is a venue where different interpretations of the past can meet in civil discourse with penetrating questions coming from you. So that, and of course, penetrating questions coming from one historian to another. Like Haley and Hardin, I guess. Maybe nicer than that today. With penetrating questions, asking historians, could you maybe know more about something? Could you have been wrong about something? And could you maybe by knowing a bit more about this, change the way you believe the past really was? Or, and not just which bullet hit which flesh on which creek on which day, but what was in the heads of those people? And not just the heads of the Rangers, but the heads of those other people who were men of pride and honor and violence, who were defending their homes, just like the Texas Rangers were men of pride and honor and violence who felt they were defending their homes. It may or may not be possible, and this is the last big question, it may or may not be possible to come to a final answer about the inevitability of conflict or the inevitability of historical development. But having been raised as a Southern Baptist, I believe in free will. I believe we have choices to make. And if I believe we have choices to make, I believe those men had choices to make, both individually and collectively through the political system. And it may be that by looking at the fiasco of some of the policies followed, you may think they were Houston's, you may think they were Lamar's. But if you look at some of the fiascos of policies followed, that you may have some lessons learned. Boy, does this sound timely. Some lessons learned about how you might be able to mitigate the pain, how you might be able to mitigate the violence, how you might be able to mitigate the wasted lives and wasted money that come from unnecessary war. That's one of the questions that is a legitimate question when you look at our own wars that were taking place right here. Wars produce glorious images and extraordinary valor, and they also produce the worst of human life. And we shouldn't take too simplistic a notion or too celebratory a notion of what this violence was like in Texas. We should open our minds from both sides of the question to the lessons that can be learned from taking a long, hard, analytical, and archivally tenacious look at our past. Neither one of these men has been willing to believe all the stories that other people have told them. And they're willing to go in and take a hard look for themselves and then to bring their lessons learned to you. The first of our speakers this afternoon is Stephen L. Moore. My ancestors go back in the Smoky Mountains for thousands of years, being part Cherokee, but not nearly as far back in Texas as this man's ancestors. They were there at San Jacinto. They were there in the Texas Rangers, and they were there among the Cherokee as well, as I believe. And so he brings a sense of duty, a sense of a burden of history from both sides of this conflict that raged over Texas during the Revolution and the Republic, to the many books he's done. If you want to know what I think about his books, all you have to do is pick up Volume 2 or Volume 3, where I say anyone with an interest in the Texas Republic or in the nature of frontier warfare in the early 19th century would want to have this book on the shelf. It will also be, pardon me, it will also be a gold mine for Texas genealogists. And any of you who have worked in the Texas State Archives have worked with Donnelly Bryce. And what Donnelly had to say about Stephen's work on the Texas Rangers in the 3 volumes, which are soon to become 4, is that Moore has done an extraordinary job of exhaustively researching his subject. I'm not aware of any other book that investigates this period of Ranger history with such thoroughness as Savage Frontier. The muster rolls and rosters, as well as the appendices, will be of particular interest and importance to the reader. Dr. Anderson and Stephen will have different ideas about a lot of things. They'll probably have different ideas about the Shawnee Rangers and exactly what men like that meant to the history of Texas. I know what it meant to me. I was reading that section of Savage Frontier out on the back deck with my cat, Nigel, whom I renamed Captain Panther after the leader of the Texas Shawnee Rangers. That's the name. That's the correct name, right? Captain Panther. That's one of the more fascinating muster rolls that you will find in the work of Stephen Moore.
When people think of the Texas Rangers, they often remember of them pursuing famous outlaws, such as Sam Bass or Bonnie and Clyde. Going back to the earlier period of the Rangers, they think of some of the most famous Ranger captains, people that made their names legendary in Texas, like Jack Hayes, Bigfoot Wallace, and Rip Ford. But long before these men were even famous in Texas, there were hundreds of other men who served during the Texas Revolution. We, of course, remember the battle that gave us the rallying cries of "Remember the Alamo" and "Remember Goliad." But what history is not so well documented is the role of the Texas Rangers during the Texas Revolution and the Battle of San Jacinto. In writing the Savage Frontier series, I found a little bit of information on the Revolutionary Rangers, but not nearly as much as I thought I would find. And so, as we've alluded to here, it took a little bit of digging to get in there and find some more information. I had an ancestor that was part of it, and that kind of compelled me to dig in and find out more. And after finding out what I did, it kind of led to the Savage Frontier series of how much there really was to learn out there about it. The first really major work I consider published on the Texas Rangers was in 1935, of course, by Walter Prescott Webb, his book, The Texas Rangers. But in this book, he really only used the memoirs of Noah Smithwick as his primary account, and he let Smithwick tell the account of the Rangers during the Revolution just from one man's perspective. You're carried through the runaway scrape, and really from that account, you're not led to believe that there were any Rangers that had any significant part in the San Jacinto campaign or in the battle itself. There's been a number of other Texas Ranger histories in more recent years, but most of them barely scratch the surface as well. One of them mentions the Tomlinson Rangers again, and another goes in and mentions the Alamo Rangers under Lieutenant George Kimball and gives them some credit. But most of these still do not give any indication that any Rangers actually made it to the Texas Army during the Revolution. The only one I've seen that's done a pretty decent job was Thomas Knowles in his book, They Rode for the Lone Star. He gives credit both to Tomlinson's company and to the Alamo Rangers and to others who made it to the Texas Army in time for the battle. So today I plan to discuss some of the companies and some of the men that were in the Texas Revolution that made it to the battle, men of the ranging service that I'd like to call the unsung heroes of San Jacinto. One of the lesser-known facts about the Texas Rangers is that they were legally and formally created due to the revolution in Texas. It was during this time that the lawmen who still serve this state had their roots organized. During the War for Texas Independence, the Rangers played important roles at the Alamo, protecting the settlers during the runaway scrape, in keeping watch on the advancing Mexican army, and in the San Jacinto battle itself. All told, there were at least 16 companies of Texas Rangers in service between October 1835 and April 1836. The approximate number of men who served in these companies was anywhere between 350 and 400 men. Some of these are counted because they moved from one company to another. Now, in actuality, there were more than 80 men who were actually on the San Jacinto battleground or guarding the supplies at Harrisburg who were in the Ranger service or had just recently left the ranging service. My best count is 83 men total. I'd like to fill you in on some of the development of the companies that served during the Texas Revolution and on these men that made it to the San Jacinto battlegrounds. I'll go through here and I'll kind of go a little bit into each company as best I have time and let you know how many made it from each company to the actual battleground. Now, of course, companies that operated as Rangers in Texas as early as the 1820s, so I'm not going to debate the actual date of when the ranging service started, but they were legally and formally created due to the Revolution. During the summer of 1835, a four-ranging company under Colonel John Henry Moore had gone out from Fort Parker on expedition. Not long after this, the Texas Revolution kind of came into play, and that's where legal means were created to start the ranging service to help protect the frontiers. Now, this slide shows the ranging service districts that were created at the beginning of the Revolution. 2 weeks after the opening skirmish at Gonzales, the legal council was meeting in San Felipe. Daniel Parker Sr., the organizer of the first non-Catholic church in Texas, proposed, quote, a corps of Texas Rangers to consist of small detachments stationed on the Indian frontier. You can see that the different ranging districts were basically broken up by the major rivers of Texas. His resolution passed and the ranger districts were created. This slide shows that there were three major ranger battalions that would serve during the Revolution. We'll get to Major Williamson and Colonel Jesse Benton's regiment in a little bit, but first we'll start with these regional superintendents that we saw the districts of right there. The ranger district superintendents as originally set up were Silas Parker, Daniel Boone Fryer, Garrison Greenwood, and George Washington Davis. Daniel Parker, seen here, had proposed a resolution for the Ranger Corps. His brother, Silas Parker, was to operate 25 Rangers between the Brazos and the Trinity Rivers. His company operated from Fort Parker, which at that time was also known as Fort Sterling. The first Ranger company formed during the Texas Revolution was that of Captain Eli Hillhouse. They served from Fort Parker, and the command later passed after Hillhouse's death to Captain Eli Seal. A second, smaller Ranger company also operated from Fort Parker. It was commanded by another of the Parker brothers, Captain James Wilson Parker. Over the years, the Texas Rangers would be served at times by friendly Indians who provided them scouting services. Several years later, entire companies of Indians would serve with the Rangers. These would be Apaches and Tonkawas, among others, and they would even fill out muster rolls for their service. One of the first Indians to serve with a Ranger company was with one of the Parker's Fort companies. He was a Cherokee Indian that provided scouting services for 1 month, who entered his name on their actual muster roll. Now, west of the Parker's region, the next district established was between the Brazos and the Colorado rivers. I can scroll back here. The superintendent name for this region was Daniel Boone Fryer, who was the only Ranger superintendent who also doubled as the company's Ranger captain. His company was organized on November 1st, 1835, and operated within Robertson's colony. At least 6 of the men who fought at San Jacinto had come from Captain Fryer's company. Fryer's Rangers made at least one skirmish with Indians near the San Gabriel River, and they lost 2 horses in this attack. His company was disbanded in February 1836, and from this company, James and Stephen Jett went on to serve in Captain Richard Roman's Company B of the 1st Regiment at San Jacinto. Another former Friar Ranger, Benjamin Fitch, joined Captain Robert Calder's company and fought at San Jacinto. Several others from Friar's company would join Captain Joseph Chance's Washington Guards. Garrison Greenwood, as you see here, was the 3rd Ranger Superintendent who was set up. He had also come to Texas with Parker and their church. He was given the territory between the Trinity and the Neches River, and this was in East Texas. His 10-man company was placed under the command of my great-great-great-grandfather, Captain William Turner Sadler. He was distantly related in marriage to Mirabeau B. Lamar, the future president of Texas. Now, Sadler and Lamar had come to Texas together in 1835, and they met up on a steamboat, and they traveled by steamboat and stagecoach and horses all the way through Nacogdoches and came into Texas there where they parted ways, and they would not meet up again until after the Battle of San Jacinto. Captain Sadler was a veteran of the Seminole and Creek Indian Wars back east. He was captain of the 10-man company of Rangers under Greenwood that was established and set up their muster on January 1st, 1836. And the Parker family kind of got around those days with the Texas Rangers because 2 of Sadler's men were more of the Parkers, brothers Dickerson Parker and Daniel Parker Jr., both brothers of Ranger Superintendent Silas Parker. Now, Sadler's company took up station in what is now Anderson County, and one time was Houston County. It's a little town now that has become Palestine, but what they worked on establishing was a fort which became known as Fort Houston. This is an early illustration of what the fort probably looked like. It was a blockhouse that would also serve as a fortification from Indian attacks and a staging point for militia expeditions for years to come in the future there in East Texas. The little community was known as Houston, Texas, not to be confused with that near Harrisburg, which eventually became Houston here. That, of course, in East Texas became Palestine later. When word came about the fall of the Alamo, Sadler's his men decided to head for the Army and join Sam Houston. 8 out of the 10 headed out to join the Army. They crossed the Trinity River on March 19th, and his men would join up on the Colorado River with Sam Houston's troops. On March 20th, they joined Sidney Sherman's regiment. Captain Sadler and 5 of his Rangers would fight with Captain Hayden Arnold's Nacogdoches Company. The 7th man, John Carpenter, would join the cavalry and serve as an officer. Now, following the San Jacinto battle, it was my relative, Captain Sadler, who was there when Santa Anna was brought forward. He was still, of course, dressed in the private's uniform, trying to play himself off as a common soldier. And the men began chanting, El Presidente, El Presidente. And according to family story, Sadler stepped up and ripped open the shirt, the private's jacket, to show the fancy buttons underneath for his actual military uniform. So that was his role after the battle and one of the significant parts he played. So between Friar's company and Sadler's company, we've got at least 13 former Rangers who end up at San Jacinto. The 4th regional Ranger Superintendent that was put together in 1835 was George Washington Davis. He would also end up at San Jacinto. His district included the town of Gonzales, where the Alamo's Immortal 32 would soon be organized. We'll talk more about that in just a moment. Without a ranging company left to supervise after the fall of the Alamo, Davis joined the Army and fought at San Jacinto also. Now, as the Texas Revolution progressed, the council saw a need to add more Rangers. In late November 1835, they passed a resolution to create a corps of Rangers with 3 companies of 56 men each. This corps was to be headed up by Major Robert M. Williamson. He's known more familiarly as Three-Legged Willie. As a kid, he had an affliction that caused his leg to draw up, and he was fitted with a wooden leg. But his Rangers were paid $1.25 a day. They would furnish their own horses, ammunition, and arms. The original company commanders set up under him were William Arrington, Isaac Watts Burton, and John Jackson Tumlinson. Of these 3 companies, John Tumlinson's company is the one that's been most recorded through history. His men fought a skirmish with Comanche Indians in January of 1836, probably the first, if not one of the first, battles between Rangers and Comanches. They killed 4 Indians and suffered 2 Rangers wounded in this battle. but did manage to recover a boy that had been kidnapped. Tumlinson's Rangers also built a blockhouse north of Austin, and they were instrumental during the runaway scrape in helping the settlers to make it to safety. Now, we know more about the Tumlinson Rangers than any others because of the memoirs of Noah Smithwick, one of the members. Smithwick was with the Rangers throughout the San Jacinto campaign, and he left good stories of their service. He would serve in the Rangers from January of 1836 all the way into 1837 under the commands of Captain John Tumlinson, Isaac Burton, Dickinson Putnam, and Micah Andrews. Now, Tumlinson's company received orders from Major Williamson on February 26 to head out from Brushy Creek and head for Bastrop. There, they were to scout and keep track of the Mexican army. And this is where Smithwick has left a number of good stories for us. According to him, once word of the Alamo's fall spread, the fleeing citizens of the runaway scrape did not need protection. We were ordered to cover their retreat and afterwards join General Houston, he wrote. And during the runaway scrape, the company dropped down quickly to 22 men. Major Williamson accompanied the men as far as he could, but finally had to leave them behind because of their slow pace, with some of the men being without horses. Williamson took 2 of the privates with him and headed on ahead to join the Texas Army. And most of the Tumlinson Rangers would miss out on joining the Army in time for the battle. Now, some of Tumlinson's men did come back and join the Army just in time and catch up with Williamson on about April 17th. Those that had gone back to escort their families obviously didn't make it, but Gainey Crosby joined the 2nd Regiment of the Texas Army on the 17th. He fought at San Jacinto. Captain Tumlinson and 2 other men from his company, Jimmy Curtis and Henry Redfield, also joined the 1st Regiment in time for the battle. Conrad Rohr, who we talked about earlier, he'd fought the Comanches with Tumlinson back in January. He caught up and became the Army's wagon master. Now, the 2nd captain of Williamson's regiment that was set up was Captain Isaac Burton. His company also becomes scattered before the Battle of San Jacinto, and not as many of the names of his men are actually known. But we know that Captain Burton and Lieutenant Thomas Robbins all definitely made it to the battle and fought there as privates in the cavalry. Robbins, in fact, was one of the 18 cavalrymen who pursued the men toward Bence's Bridge and shot down some of the fleeing cavalrymen and tried to capture Santa Ana on the day of the battle. Sylvanus Cottle and James Manning were also they were assigned to the baggage at Harrisburg, but they had also been members of Burton's company and would rejoin it after the battle. Following the battle, Burton's men were, of course, the ones that went down and captured the Mexican sailing vessels and became known as the Horse Marines. So they kind of became pretty famous after the battle there. During early April, Major Williamson was operating out of Washington on the Brazos, directing the efforts of the early Ranger Battalion, and he received orders from Secretary of War Rust to open up another company. Now, these men he put together were to be rangers and spies responsible for keeping track of the Mexican army. So that's a little different than most of the ones out there traditionally thought to protect against Indian attacks. He organized a company under Captain Joseph Bell Chance, and a lot of his men, or some of them, had actually served under Fryer and Robertson earlier as previous rangers. During early April, Chance's company moved out of Washington and became part of the Texas Army's 2nd Regiment. Chance and 36 men of his ranger company would guard the baggage at Harrisburg. Another 4 of his rangers left Harrisburg with the Army and fought in Captain Stevenson's infantry company. So of the 3 ranger companies that were organized by Major Robert Williamson during the Revolution, those of Captains Tumlinson, Burton, and Chance each contributed some patriots to the San Jacinto Army. 3-Legged Willie himself actually caught up with the Army and fought as a private in Captain William Smith's cavalry company. So if you're trying to keep track of the Rangers at this point, we've got a multi-district ranging system that was opened up in October 1835. And then later in 1835, we had Major 3-Legged Willie's regiment. This slide shows that there were at least 16 ranger companies whose captains had a command during the Texas Revolution. The names in the left-hand column are some of the ones that we've already discussed under Williamson. In the right-hand column, there's some other individuals who had companies that were formed for various reasons throughout the course of the February or March of 1836. So I'll try to quickly run down some of these men and what they contributed to San Jacinto. This is Captain Sterling Robertson. In Robertson's colony, there was an Indian attack which motivated the impresario to form his own ranger company on January 17, 1836. He had a large company of men with 65 mustered in originally. His unit was known to have gone out at least once against Indians during its time. Robertson himself was called to the convention in late February, and there's no evidence that he continued throughout March with his company. Still, 12 of his rangers would help guard the baggage at Harrisburg or fight with various companies at San Jacinto. Captain Robertson himself would arrive just in time to help guard the baggage at Harrisburg. Another of the independent companies was that of Captain Lewis Franks. I guess I'll keep that there. His company was organized on February 1st and operated as high north as Waco, where the Waco village was. His 30-man unit had a cannon that was left behind by Mexicans that had abandoned one of the garrisons there, and one of his plans actually involved taking out a wagon with rangers hidden in it, covered over, having a couple riding ahead and a couple riding behind to try to ambush some of the rangers, some of the Indians that might attack them. Now, there's no evidence that this actually was carried out, but he had a pretty bold plan for that period of time. Once his company was mustered out by April 1st, at least 2 of his men went on to serve at San Jacinto, that being Alfred Benton and Thomas Plaster. Both of these joined the Texas Artillery because of their experience with the cannon, and they would operate the Twin Sisters on April 21st. Now, additional ranger companies were also created in February due to the fact that Three-Legged Willie's Ranger Battalion was never completely formed. As related, only 2 of his 3 originally slated companies made it into service, that of Tomlinson and that of Burton. The third one under Captain Arrington was never completely organized or organized at all that I could tell. So the interim Texas government decided to appoint 6 ranger recruiters to go out and help try to fill in some of the gaps here. For Gonzales, the ranger recruiters were Matthew Paint Caldwell, Bird Lockhart, and William Matthews. For the Milam municipality, the 3 recruiters were men that had already served in the Rangers or had already held command: Joseph Parker, Captain Daniel Fryer, and David Falconberry. These recruiters would help the civilians put together ranging companies. When they'd pulled together the first 28 men, the men could elect their first lieutenant. Once they pulled together another 28 men and had a complete company of 56, then they could elect a captain. So before these could even be pulled together, another small ranger company was formed, that of Captain Stephen Townsend. His men were formed in Robertson's colony on February 1st. Excuse me. The ranger commissioners and Major Williamson decided to deploy Townsend's rangers to the head of Mill Creek to look for Indians. Since his men only included about a dozen, he should not have been considered a captain, but more or less considered a lieutenant under these new ranger rules. But he would later be paid as a captain by the Republic of Texas. Townsend's rangers were at the east bank of the Colorado River on March 19th when they received word of the fall of the Alamo. His men rushed to join up with the Texas Army and marched to Harrisburg. There, about 9 of his rangers were put to guarding the baggage at Harrisburg and left with the sick men. But at least 3 did see battle with the Texas Army. Captain Townsend and his brother, Spencer Burton Townsend, joined the cavalry as privates, and Ranger James Byrd was also temporarily assigned to Captain Hurd's Army Company. One of the most significant contributions with the Rangers that were there to defend the Alamo. The newly appointed Ranger recruiters went to work in Milam and Gonzales municipalities during February. In the town of Gonzales, Bird Lockhart began organizing a company while the Alamo was under siege. On February 23rd, he had his first 28 men together, and they elected Lieutenant George Kimball as their leader. Kimball was the co-owner of a hat factory. His partner in business was commanding the artillery at the Alamo at the time. A messenger, Albert Martin, rode in from the Alamo with one of the famous appeals from Travis, telling about the grim situation. Kimball and Martin worked on recruiting more men and headed to San Antonio on February 27th. Martin, Kimball, and the 30 Gonzales Rangers raced past the Mexican troops into the Alamo on March 1st. And when the Alamo fell on the 6th, these 32 men from Gonzales became known as the Immortal 32. Now, we also know from surviving military papers that at least 2 of Kimball's men did not make it into the Alamo on March 1st. In a sworn affidavit of May 24th, 1836, Colonel Edwin Morehouse affirmed that one of Kimball's Rangers, John T. Ballard, was cut off by cavalrymen near the Alamo and became separated from his company. Ballard then found and joined the company of Captain John Tomlinson. He was accompanied by fellow Ranger Prospect McCoy, who was also cut off from entering the Alamo. During the course of the campaign, McCoy would join the runaway scrape settlers in fleeing. Ballard would join the Army company of Captain Thomas Rabb and fight in the battle. Now, incidentally, Thomas Lindley, in his book Alamo Traces, asserts that there was another group under Captain Tomlinson that made it into the Alamo on March 4th. I'm not a subscriber to another group of Rangers making it into the Alamo. I won't bore you with the details on that, but I did do a lengthy paper on that that's on the Texas Rangers website on their museum, so feel free to check that out. Another small ranging unit that was in play during this time from between Bastrop and the Alamo was when Captain Jesse Billingsley had formed his company in Bastrop. Burleson put together a small group of scouts that was to go out and keep track of the Mexican army as they approached. They were organized on February 24th, and they were under Captain Thomas G. McGehee. His men included David F. Owen, Martin Walker, David Halderman, and Michael Sessom. Sessom was an interpreter of the Spanish and Indian languages. And they were in Bastrop for a time during March, and most of these men would join the Texas Army along the San Jacinto campaign. David Owen's service papers show that he joined Sam Houston's army on March 16th. Walker would later fight with Captain Billingsley's company. Now, this slide goes back to some of the Ranger forces that were in operation. As you can see, we had a number of smaller companies that were put together, and people came from far and wide to join Sam Houston in the days prior to the battle. If you're trying to keep up with the scorecard, you've got the regional ranging system that we talked about first. You've got Williamson's battalion. You've got the recruiter organized companies, including the one that made it into the Alamo. And you've got a number of independent companies that were put together. But now, in addition to this, on March 3rd, there's a 3rd Ranger battalion that's put into play here that we're going to talk about. At the end of February, Major Williamson's Ranger battalion had still not reached its full strength. There was also another deadly Indian attack against Robertson's colony people on February 26th. The convention at Washington on the Brazos therefore decided that an additional Ranger company needed to be put together to supplement those in the field. This one would be under Colonel Jesse Benton and Lieutenant Colonel Griffin Bain. As opposed to other Rangers, Benton's Rangers would actually receive the same pay as men from the Army and be subject to the orders of the Army. During late March, Benton moved north to work on a military road that would lead to the Red River. He left Lieutenant Colonel Bain in charge of the men and to continue recruiting. Anybody that Benton actually recruited or any company he put together, I have not been able to ascertain a name of a company. But as far as Lieutenant Colonel Bain, we know that at least of one company that was put together on March 1st, that of Captain William C. Wilson. Like Major Williamson, some of the Rangers under Bain and Wilson would also catch up with the Army shortly before San Jacinto. At least 2 of the men from this regiment, Daniel Dunham and Francis Weathered, are known to have fought with the Texas Army at San Jacinto. Both of these men also joined the artillery company. So of the 16 Ranger companies that were formed during the Texas Revolution, at least 10 of them were in operation by mid-March. As the runaway scrape progressed and the Texas Army retreated toward Harrisburg, the Rangers became scattered. From at least the 350 to 400 men that served at one time or another during the Revolution as Rangers, I find that at least 83 of them were present for the fight on the battlegrounds or were part of the Army's baggage guard at Harrisburg. Some had recently departed the ranging service and become part of the Texas Army. Others became attached to the Army just for the battle and later continued with their Ranger commands after the battle was over. A study of the muster rolls of these ranger companies shows a very fluid movement of men into the companies of the Army and then back out again. There was little need to defend the frontiers against Indians at a time when the Mexican Army was marching across Texas. So in the days and the hours immediately preceding the battle, ranger captains and their officers joined a variety of companies. Many served as privates in the Texas Cavalry, since they were already equipped with horses and good firearms for shooting from horses. The men who'd served as rangers were well adapted to operating quickly in the field on horseback, and they just offered good seasoned protection, good experience as frontiersmen. Their fighting ability would be put to good use at San Jacinto. Now, General Sam Houston obviously found the ragtag companies in the state they came to him to be pretty easy targets to deploy as camp guards at Harrisburg. The sheer number of ranger officers or former ranger officers who left their command and just joined up as mere privates in the Texas Army to fight at the battle shows how unpopular it obviously was for the rangers to be left behind at Harrisburg to guard baggage. Now, whether these men were left guarding the baggage at Harrisburg or whether they were actually in the companies that did the fighting, I'd just like to acknowledge them for their contribution to the independence of Texas. I don't think any great tribute has been paid to the Ranging Service of Texas other than perhaps Tumlinson's company, possibly since a lot of these companies have long been masked by the lack of people digging in to see how many actually were in operation during that time. But from what I've been able to find, more than 10 companies probably played a role, and from these 10 companies, men were present in the strength of at least 83 on April 21st. And to them, I salute the frontier spirit of keeping the peace and making the charge at San Jacinto or doing their part at Harrisburg. I'm not standing here saying that without them, old Sam couldn't have won the battle, but certainly 80-odd people was a significant number to be contributed to what he had available that day on the battlefield or before the battle at Harrisburg. And their experience certainly was a good contribution. This is a list of the men that I've been able to put together, at least 83. Four of them unnamed in Townsend's group that I have not been able to find their actual names, but just know from the number of the company. And I'd just like to see in future histories of San Jacinto that, as we're giving credit to various other groups, let's give some credit to the Rangers, the unsung heroes of San Jacinto. Thank you.